Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to make another set of cards. I have been loving this Cheerful Daisy stamp set from Sunny Studio. I'm not going to use the die set today. I'm going to use just the stamp set to create a background. But this is a stamp layering set. It takes a little bit of time to build up those flowers. So while I'm building those up and making one card, I might as well cut some more panels and use that time wisely and make a set of cards. Now, before I've even started, I've made some masks from both the larger and the smaller flowers in that set, and I've cut some A2 size cardstock panels that I'll be using. I'm making 3 cards today. You can easily scale this up or down and make 10, 20 cards if you wanted to, because once you have these stamps positioned, all you need to do is switch out your panel and continue to stamp until you have all of your panels stamped. Now, in order to do this, I am using my stamp positioner. I'm using my larger MISTI. This would work in a mini MISTI as well. And I'm also using Creative Corners. Up there in the top right-hand corner of my MISTI, you can see I have that little triangle up there. That pops my paper away from the edges, but still gives me a nice right angle to be able to line my paper up each time. Now I'm starting off with dye ink, stamping down the solid layer of the flowers. My first color is Aquatini from Catherine Pooler, and I'll be double stamping this layer onto each one of my card panels. Now here's the fun part. Once I have those lined up and stamped, the next thing I need to do is just take out my paper and insert a clean one and stamp on the next panel. And there I can start building up each one of my cards. All I have to do is switch out the paper in order to continue to stamp out my panels. This is something I like to do, especially if I'm making a very intricate background. If I'm making plaids or things like that, I'll often do this just to make it so much easier on myself and to get the most out of the time I'm spending. It only takes a few extra minutes to stamp those extra panels once everything's lined up. So once I have that first layer stamped, I'm going to go ahead, clean off those stamps and remove them. Now I'll line up the second layer of these flowers, which is more of the details. And then once I have them both positioned, I'm going to go ahead and pick them up with the lid of my MISTI. I like to stamp 2 of these at once. That way I am getting, again, the most out of the time I'm spending. Now my second layer, I'm going to use a pigment ink. This is going to sit on top of the dye ink and not blend with the ink that could still be wet underneath. I'm using Warm Breeze. This is from VersaFine Clair. And I'll just ink up those stamps once I know they're positioned correctly and just stamp those down right on top. And this is just going to give a little bit of detail to those flowers underneath. Now once I have my first panel stamped, all I have to do is remove the panel and insert the next one and stamp it down. Because I used that stamp positioner on the first go round, this is going to line up perfectly as well and stamp right down onto that second set of flowers. Once that's done, it's time to do a little bit of masking. To mask, you can use regular masking paper like the Inkadinkado masking paper. However, I am going to be removing and replacing these masks quite often. Now, whenever I do that with my masking paper from Inkadinkado, it ends up not being really sticky and kind of wanting to lift up and move around on me. So I found label paper from Amazon. I only use this in cases where I want a really good stick and I know the paper needs to stick down several times and go through several rounds of me moving it around. This is one of those cases. It's also much cheaper than masking paper and you get a lot of it in one package. Once I had those flowers masked, I went ahead and lined up the leaves, and I'll stamp those down just wherever I think I want some leaves. Now, these leaves have 3 layers, but I am only using 2 here. I'm using the solid, which I stamped with Grass Skirt, a dye ink from Catherine Pooler. And now I'll use these kind of half leaves and just line those up on the stamps and stamp these down as well. Now the ink I'm going to use for this is Green Oasis, which is a pigment ink from VersaFine Clair. I'm using the dye ink underneath to stamp my solid images and then a pigment ink on top. This is going to allow me to move quicker, not wait for those dye inks to completely dry, and this way I don't have any chance of the inks mixing. My next layer for my flowers is going to be, or my next color is going to be Tiki Torch. This is the dye ink. This is the solid portion. Again, I'm using 2 flowers at once here. And with each of these dye layers, I am double stamping. I'm already using my Misty, so I might as well get the best impression that I possibly can. Once I have down my dye layer on each one of my panels, I'll go ahead and switch over to my next layer. I've cleaned off that solid stamp, lined up the detail stamp, and then I'll stamp this down with the Summertime ink. This is a pigment ink. Again, this is VersaFine Clair Summertime ink. Now once I have those down, it's time to go ahead and move my masks. Now these masks do want to stick quite well, so take your time when removing them. They do peel up easily, but these masks, like I said, they stick. This is not a masking paper you want to run through your die cutting machine. So keep that in mind. If you buy some of this and you want to use it for masking your projects, this is not one you want to run through your die cutting machine. That pressure is going to get this to stick permanently. If you want to run a mask through a die cutting machine, I highly suggest using Inkadinkado masking paper, which doesn't have a ton of stick or a post-it note. Now once I have those flowers and leaves stamped, I'm going to go ahead and move things around again. Now here's where you can get kind of creative with how many stamps you're comfortable stamping at one time. What I like to do is once I have a good base and I kind of get going and kind of get into a rhythm, then I start adding in more stamps as I'm stamping down. So here I wanted to add two leaves on each one of my little orange flowers. So I'm going to go ahead and line up those leaves, and I also went ahead and placed my next flower stamps that I'm going to be stamping. This is just going to save me a little bit of time. However, I'm not comfortable inking these up at the same time just because sometimes I can get ahead of myself and end up inking up all one color, or I just get a little bit too worked up, I guess you could say. So I like to ink up each one individually. So I stamped out my greens, and then I'll go ahead and ink up my flowers and stamp those out as well. But just having them all on my Misty and stamping them down really saves me a little bit of time when going back and lining these up. Now I've went ahead, cleaned those all off, taken them off, and lined up all of the detail stamps. Then I'll go ahead and stamp these down the exact same way. I like to do my 2 sets of colors and just really keep things nice and clean here. Again, using that green Oasis ink on top of the grass skirt for my green flowers. And then for my purple flowers, I use Pixie Dust as the dye ink layer, which is from Catherine Pooler. And then on top of that is Purple Delight ink from VersaFine Clair. Now here's where you can just kind of start having some fun. Once I got all of my flowers on, I'm just going to start filling in those extra spaces with leaves. So I moved my little masks from the orange flowers and I put them on the purple flowers, and I'm stamping out those leaves. But all around the edges there was quite a bit of white space. So I'm just going to start filling in those areas with more leaves. You can use more flowers if you want to, but I just ended up stamping leaves to make this super easy on myself, and that way I can stamp like 4 of those at once, or get 4 leaves going at once by stamping solid and then lining up and stamping the details on top of that. Now once I had all of my panels done, it's time to start stamping the center of the flowers. The center of the flowers come in 2 sizes, the large and the small, but they also have 3 steps. I'm only using 2. That's something to keep in mind when you use stamp layering sets. You don't have to use all the layers by any means. Pick and choose which ones you want to use and what look right for your project. Now for these, I am using 2 colors of VersaFine Clair. For the solid center, I use Cheerful, which is a nice bright yellow, and then I am adding the 3rd layer. I skipped the 2nd layer and went straight to the 3rd one, and for that I'm using Acorn, which is a nice kind of soft brown color right on top of that yellow. Now for those, I did not use my stamp positioner. I find it easier to just stamp those by hand and go through each panel. So keep that in mind too as you make your backgrounds. Is it going to be easier to line these up in your stamp positioner, or is it just going to be easier to stamp some of those elements by hand on each one of the panels? Now, once I had all of my panels done, it's time to move on to completing the cards. I wanted somewhere to put my sentiment, so what I ended up doing was cut some clear acetate. This is actually Duralar film, and this is going to allow me a place to kind of attach my sentiment banner and highlight it, but not cover up any of that background. To make this stand out a little bit, I did run those ovals that I die cut with an embossing folder through my die cut machine. That's just going to add a little bit of texture, and this is a fun way to highlight those sentiments without covering up any of the stamping you did. A lot of times I'll use vellum for that, but in this case I wanted those very bright colors to not be dulled at all by the vellum, so I went with the Duralar film. Once I had those made, I also die cut some flag banners while I had my die cutting machine out. Onto each one of those banners, I'm going to stamp the hello sentiment from that Cheerful Daisy stamp set with some VersaFine Clair and Nocturne, which is the nice dark black ink that stamps really crisply. To separate these layers and to separate that clear film from the background, because it's going to disappear a little bit, I am using foam. Now, you have to be careful when you're using adhesive on these clear pieces because it's going to show through unless you have that flag banner over the top of it. So I put that flag banner right in the center, and then on the back of that banner, I'm going to add another piece of foam on the back of the clear piece, and that's going to pop that clear piece away from the background. Plus, adding that little bit of dimension with the embossing folder really helps those clear pieces stand out as well. Now, the last thing to do was add each one of these to the card base, these panels to the card base. And you might be wondering why I didn't just stamp on the card base. You can see as I turn that over, you're going to get some smudges on the back. If this was a card base, that would be showing up on your card base. I like to stamp on panels when I'm doing a lot of stamping like this. And then when all is said and done, I can die cut it to any size I want it. If I wanted to go that route, I can cut these down and make 6 cards or 7 cards or 8 cards out of them if I wanted to, or just attach the whole panel to a card base. So it really helps when planning out your design to just stamp on those panels. Then you can go and do whatever with them and you don't have any smudges. That is going to do it for me today. I hope you guys found this video helpful and you got some ideas, tips, and tricks for when you're making some card sets of your own. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, you can do that now. Don't forget all the information in the description box below. Happy crafting, everyone!